Today we're going to be painting our lighthouses. We're going to be using the part 1 video for the lighthouse, our pencil reference for the shapes and the composition. In this episode we will be going into the color shading and our watercolor techniques. Alright, let's get started. Okay, so today we will need our artwork from our previous video, part 1 for the lighthouse watercolor. I have 2 cups of water, one to rinse my brush, one to get fresh water for my colors so they don't get muddy. I have 3 sizes of brush. I have a large, a medium, and a small. Small for the small details, large is for the large washes of water. I have something to mix my paint with. This is a porcelain tray. You can use a porcelain paint. Watercolor will wash right off of porcelain. I have a paper towel, and last but not least I have watercolors. I have this little set right here that has warm and cool versions of every color. Okay, so let's get started. Alright, so the first thing I did was I taped my artwork down. When you're working with watercolors, even though we're using a heavier quality watercolor paper, it could still warp a little bit if it's not held down. I taped it with blue painter's tape. Once this is dry, it'll peel right up and it'll give you a nice clean white border. So the first thing I'm going to do is we're going to do the wet on wet technique, and if you saw my previous videos you're familiar with that. And it's just, we're just using plain clean water and we're wetting the paper, not soaking the paper, just wetting the paper. And what we're doing is we're going to start with the sky. The sky is by far the biggest portion of our painting, and it's requires the most amount of color. So I'm going to continue this for a moment and we'll be back to color this in. So now that I wet all the sky portion of my paper, you can tell it's hard to tell in my video, but you'll notice like there's just this wet sheen that's left behind. And what we're going to do is we're going to start building a section of color for the sky. My lighthouse is actually going to be set on a bright sunny day, so a nice blue sky is what we're looking for. And what we're going to do, we're going to try to cover as much of the sky in a blue tone as possible. You can leave the spots open for clouds, or we can come back in and add some clouds over on top. So what you want to know, or want to keep in mind rather, is you want it to be darkest at the top and lightest towards the bottom. And you can use as much or as little water as you want depending on how saturated the color is. So just coming back in here, and as we get towards the bottom it's going to have just a lighter wash of blue. So we just need to get a hint of that bright sky. And the thing we also have to keep in mind is the watercolors will dry lighter, so you might have to go in and add more color if you want that color to be more saturated. Now as we get down to where the horizon line is that we left, it should be closest to white. So I will go in quickly with a smaller brush in these tight areas. And the great thing about the sky is that there's a variety of tones so it doesn't have to be a perfect gradient, especially with a cloudy day. If you want to add clouds after the fact, I'll show you in just a second as soon as I get the edges taken care of. And that's a little too dark for my liking, so I'll go ahead and get some water and I'm going to just brush it and pull the color down so it's a little bit lighter. And this is the time you have that freedom to do it. Now if you want clouds after you put down water, just get some paper towel and start blotting sections where you want to lift the color. You have a bit of freedom at this point on where you can put the clouds. As the paint dries, you're going to have a little less freedom. It's still possible, just a little harder, and it takes a little bit more time. So maybe this is getting a little dark for my liking here, so I'm just going to pull the color down around my sailboats. Probably should use a smaller brush, but you get the idea. So this is our sky. We'll let this dry and we'll go back on to our next step, which is going to be the ocean. While we're waiting for the sky to dry, we're going to go ahead and we're going to start the ocean. It's mostly dry. You just really want to make sure that the edges do not touch, because that's when watercolor tends to bleed into the other colors. So what we're going to do, the ocean is going to be reflecting the sky, so we're still going to use the sky blue. I'm just going to come in with some of our warm blue and we're going to give it some contrast. So clean my brush, warm blue, and what we're going to do is we are going to start from the bottom here and we're going to work our way to the top. So it's going to be darker on the bottom and we're going to lighten it on the way to the top. And this time, just for demonstration, I didn't wet the paper like I didn't do the wet on wet technique, kinda because I wanted you to see the contrast and how the water absorbs. It's not going to be as smooth. You can still get a gradient, but it's just not going to be as easy to blend as the when you have the wet on wet technique. Now I am still bringing in some wet water on top of color to kind of smooth it out, but also the other reason is because I kind of want a sharp line when it comes to the base of this land structure. So I'm actually going to start that. I'm just going to draw a line, and it's going to be a pretty harsh line, and my sky is pretty dry, so I'm going to just put that there, and then I'm just going to come in between, and I'm just going to smooth the colors right in between. So I want the hard edge to be left alone, so I'm only going to do the bottom part of that line I just created. The other reason I did that was because that landmass is creating a shadow, so I did want it a little bit darker to give that illusion of a shadow. Alright, so now that I have that, we're going to let this portion dry. Okay, so I let this dry for a little while, and I noticed that some areas is what we call bloomed. It's when the water keeps spreading and kind of creates this border. Some people like it, some people don't. I do like it, but it's not what I want for today. So, well, at least right here where that boat is. So I'm going to take some of my blue. I can actually reactivate this dried bit of watercolor. True watercolor can be reactivated multiple times, and I am going to use some clean water I'm just going to bring it down. I'm just going to smooth it out. So if you have any areas which we call bloom, we can always, as I said, just add a little bit more water and color to it. I'm also going to kind of bring it down a little bit so it's almost like a shadow on my boat, so I can actually kind of blend all that stuff in. Alright, the next step. I also noticed that I had some colors, I guess I let some water bleed onto my lighthouse, and I didn't want to do that, so you can get some water, reactivate the color, and you can kind of lift some of that color off. It's not a big deal if we can't, because we are going to cover it, and there's ways around painting it. So the next step we're going to do is we're going to start painting the lines in the lighthouse, and I'm going to use mostly this vibrant red. Add some water to it, and it's going to actually really pop. So I'm actually going to start, I'm going to kind of outline one end of it. I'm just going to kind of pull the color as best I can up. I don't want to oversaturate it. The beauty of watercolor is in the fact that it's almost transparent. You can almost see the layers. So, and I'm actually going to rinse my brush out, get some clean water, and I'm just going to kind of fill in this spot right here with just water, because I want this spot to be a lot lighter than this spot right here, because in my head I'm pretending that the sun's coming from this direction. So all the shadows are going to be on this side of the lighthouse, and all the highlights should be over here on this side. And I see a spot where I accidentally went over. It's much easier if you catch it early on, and I'm going to just go back in and I'm going to add a little bit more red so that contrast is more apparent. Alright, so I'm going to do the same thing with the next section. I'm going to skip, this is going to be like essentially white, but we're going to add some shadows, so it's going to have some cool blue tones too, just not as much. So it should read as a white lighthouse in the actual finished product. And I'm just going to go around the window best you can, and I see it. We're going to use this side thoroughly for our shadows and kind of just line it up from the bottom. I'm also going to just cover the whole top with this color too. And then just any spots where you see there's color bleeding through, just touch it up as you see fit. And you know what? I'm also going to do this roof the same color. Again, rinsing. And I'm just bringing the color I already put down and just creating a highlight. space right here. And I think the chimney is going to be the same color. All right. And while we're at it, I think my boat is also going to have that red. We'll unify the picture on both sides with the same color. Now, since I'm pretty happy with my sky, I'm going to not add any more colors to the sky, which allows me to now use some of my water. I'm going to activate some, this is called Payne's Gray. It's like a bluish gray. If you don't have that, black will work, but I'm just going to add some brightness to my birds. Being careful not to accidentally touch my boat that I just put some paint down. And I drew them out already, but if you see a space for some more and you're confident in your paint strokes, by all means go ahead and freehand some. I'm also going to go ahead and I'm going to use some of that Payne's Gray. I'm going to get my medium-sized brush. And I'm going to start at the base of my land, rock formation or what have you, and I'm going to paint right on the dry paper because I want some crisp lines. I'm going to kind of pull them up. So I made a line and then I'm just kind of dragging this still wet paint, and that's actually going to create some really nice shadows. Add some water, maybe a little bit more gray, because it's going to take a lot of added color for it to really show off those tones. So I'm going to do it again. I'm going to pull all that texture. So this is pretty much where we're going to stop for right now. We're going to let this dry because I have a lot of spaces that are close to each other. If you paint too close to one another in sections that are wet, they will spread, as we already found out. And I also see how my roof is kind of leaning into that lighthouse, and I didn't want to do that. So alright, we're going to let this dry and I'll see you in a little bit. Okay, so we are ready to add some more color, more contrast to our piece. We're going to go ahead and I'm actually going to get some of this like yellow, and I'm going to add a tiny, I'm actually going to pull some of that red out, and I'm going to make this almost like a sand color, and I'm going to cover the top portion. Actually, I'm going to paint the whole thing where the land is, so it's going to be kind of sandy, and all the dark spaces are just going to be shadow. So again, this is just going right over the dried cool gray tones, and it's going to kind of give it a little bit of contrast without going too over the top. Clean my brush, some fresh water. I'm actually going to pull some of this yellow with a little bit more water, and I'm going to use this tone for the sails too, but I'm going to leave the tips white. This is going to just be a little subtle color contrast. So mostly water. And then just fill in with a little bit of this tan water that we have left over. Alright, so now we can move on to some of the spaces in our lighthouse. Alright, we're going to go ahead and start coloring some windows. Now that our lighthouse components are pretty dry, I'm using my Payne's Gray, that bluish gray, and I am not adding too much water to it. So it looks pretty black. So I'm just going to go ahead and tackle all the windows while everything else is dry in the lighthouse area. It's always best to go from the farthest away to the closest. You don't want to accidentally run your hand over a wet spot. Watercolor can be kind of unforgiving in that respect. So just go ahead. And our drilling is just a guideline if it's a little bit off. So once I get that, we're going to go ahead, wait for that portion to dry, and then we're going to finish off the shadows in our lighthouse with a little bit of cool blue and a Payne's Gray on just one side. Alright, our picture is going to create some shadows right on the castle. And also, before we start, I just want to let you know that I did trace some of the line work with that Payne's Gray, that bluish gray color. So I'm actually going to, right now I'm painting just a casting shadow on the right side of this structure. And I'm going to kind of smooth it out like I did with my other ones. And luckily, because the paint is dry on the rest of my artwork, it's not going to move too much color off of it. That red will stay. The black will stay. And we're just kind of creating like this shadow region. And I'm using mostly the recycled blue I have. When you paint in shadows in the daytime, they always have a blue tint. Or anytime it's outside, even at night, a blue tint. It's only when it's indoors does that color become more grayish brown. So I'm just bringing the same tone and I'm putting that on the sailboat, just layering right over anything that would be cast in shadow. So I know that the first sail is covering a good portion of the pretend sunlight that we're imagining. So again, just using the tones and the colors I have available to me. I'm just finishing off the shadows. So maybe there's a little bit of shadow being cast there and a little bit from the roof. And then I'm going to get some water and just blend the edges. And there we go, our finished lighthouse.